Hello, this is Professor Nassar. Thank you for joining me. Today we are going to cover the anatomy of the lower abdominal GI tract. If you haven't viewed them already, I've already made a video covering the gross anatomy of the stomach, a separate video covering the gross anatomy of the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder, and finally a third video covering the anatomy of the greater omentum, lesser omentum, and dorsal mesentery. So I'm just mentioning that because you may want to view those videos first so that you have some context for the rest of the GI anatomy that is to follow in this video. As before, I will be using the terms listed in your lab handout, Unit 3, as we go through this, and I would suggest you have that as well as your textbook open to the relevant section so that you can follow along. So let's begin. In this model, this is a model of the lower GI tract, and what you can see here are the basics. The stomach is up here. This is your large intestine and small intestine, and then this is half of the greater omentum. The greater omentum, this sheet of named dorsal mesentery that attaches to the stomach, normally covers all of this. But in this case, this model and many of the models that we have only show half the greater omentum, covering half of your abdominal viscera, and then the other half is sort of been cut away so that you can see the underlying organs. So normally this fatty, lacy tissue, which we call the dorsal mesentery, otherwise known as the greater omentum, would normally be covering all of this, and we would need to literally move this out of the way in order to see the underlying abdominal organs. Okay, the stomach in this case is loose, so I'm just going to lift it up a little bit just to give you a bit of context. I've already discussed the stomach anatomy. We've already gone through the stomach anatomy already, so I'm just going to show some highlights around here and then we will move on. So again, the esophagus would normally be attaching to the stomach here at the cardiac sphincter or the cardiac opening. Up here is the fundus, the body, pyloric region, and then the stomach attaches and ends here at the pyloric sphincter, where it continues then as the small intestine, and the first subdivision of the small intestine is going to be your duodenum. Recall the stomach also has two curvatures associated with it. The outer curve is called the greater curvature. The inner curve is called the lesser curvature, and it's to these curvatures that you have the greater curvature, the greater omentum attaches. The attachment is shown here, and all of this is part of that greater omentum. And then to the lesser curvature, you have the lesser omentum attaching. Okay, I'm going to remove the stomach here just so we can see some of the other anatomical features underneath. Let's zoom in a little bit. There we go. So here we can see this organ, the pancreas, and within there, they've opened it up a little bit so you can see the pancreatic duct. Now in this model, in fact, there are two pancreatic ducts. We just want you to know the bigger of the two, which is called the major pancreatic duct, which is shown here. The tinier one, which is up here, is called the minor pancreatic duct, and you don't need to worry about that for this level of the course. Just know the major one down here. The major one then drains into the duodenum, and we'll show you that on the other side via the major duodenal papilla, or just the duodenal papilla, and that papilla, that opening, serves as a common opening for both the pancreatic duct and this little sliver of green that you can see there, which is your common bile duct. Sorry for all the shadows. I'm doing this from the not so comfort of my home, so as a result, this is very, I apologize for the low-tech approach, but this is just so those students who don't have access to the organs can at least see something in 3 dimensions to get some perspective of the anatomy of these organs. On the back side of the GI, what we're looking at here is, again, the pancreas. This part would be the tail. Here is the body. In front of or anterior to these blood vessels would be the neck. The blood vessels are things, this blood vessel is going to be, if it's not your inferior vena cava, it's branches of it, and then these are branches here, it looks like, of your aorta, of your abdominal aorta. So in front of that would be the neck of the pancreas, and then all of this sort of hugging the duodenum here would be the head of the pancreas. This is the first subdivision of your small intestine, which is your duodenum. In this case, they've opened up some of the small intestines so you can see two features in particular. Let's zoom in a bit more. First, notice the ridges that are around run through in sort of a circular manner through the all of the small intestine, and these ridges again are just called circular folds. Unlike the rugae of the stomach, these folds are permanent folds. They do not disappear when the small intestine distends. So where did I put that stomach? Hey, stomach, come back here. Here we go. So here is the stomach. We've opened it up a little bit, and again you can see the folds on here are called rugae. These rugae disappear as the stomach distends. These are called circular folds. They are found throughout the small intestine, and these are permanent folds. So again, the small intestine has three subdivisions associated with it. The first and the shortest is the duodenum, which is about 10 inches long in real life. Then next is the jejunum, which is about 8 feet long, and then the ileum, which is, I forget how long the actual ileum is. I forget if it's longer or shorter. Longer. It's about 12 feet long. So in any case, what we see here is the duodenum before it goes back anteriorly and turns into the next subdivision of your small intestine, which will be the jejunum. Everything else we see here along the outside is going to be part of your large intestine. We'll cover these regions when we get to the large intestine. The other feature to note here is all of this, which is sort of connecting your duodenum and your pancreas and your large intestine. All of this is mesentery, and you can see the extensive vascularization, the blood vessels, the arteries, and also what would also be here are the veins. The mesentery provides a route for those blood vessels to that come off of your abdominal aorta. These are mesenteric vessels that then go to supply blood to your large and small intestines. In addition to arteries, of course, there will be veins that drain the absorbed nutrients from all of these areas that drain back to, and then the hepatic portal vein will drain those venous blood back to your liver. And there will also be an extensive nerve supply going to these vessels, as well as lymphatics. Okay, let's flip this back to the front and see what we can see here. So after the duodenum, we come to the next subdivision of the small intestine, which is going to be your jejunum, which is pretty much this region up here. The region down here, inferiorly, is going to be the third subdivision of your small intestine. This will be the ileum. Now, grossly, when you're looking at this from the outside, there's no easy way to tell where the jejunum ends and the ileum begins. So in theory, your instructor is not going to ask you to identify this part of your small intestine and say, what subdivision are we looking at? Anatomically, it's not so easy to tell. Even histologically, it can be a bit challenging. So let's sort of keep it simple. We sort of will just call this upper region here part of your jejunum, and this lower region down here part of your ileum. Now, your anatomy instructor may have a different way of defining this, but that's how I will go about it. If you should really confirm with your professor and see what criteria they're using to describe this. Okay, and then the last part I just want to talk about is this. This is your greater omentum. The greater omentum here is a bit deceptive in terms of how they've shown this. It's really due to practicality. It looks like the greater omentum here is sort of just glued right onto your abdominal, onto your small intestine. But in fact, that's not really the case. The greater omentum, in real life, you could actually peel this off, and this whole flap here at the end is actually loose. So I just made a very simple rendition of this using a piece of paper towel. So if you take basically, pretend this is your greater omentum, part of your greater omentum is basically it's basically, again, a sheet of dorsal mesentery. So part of this is going to, one end of this is basically going to be attaching to your dorsal body wall, basically the inside of your back and to the inside of your abdominal cavity along your posterior side. And as it comes down, as it descends, it basically wraps around your transverse colon. So I'm just going to keep sort of one end of it here. And then what happens is as it comes down to the base of your abdominal wall here, it sort of folds back on itself, like how you might just fold it in two like this. And so the other end basically attaches to the greater curvature of your stomach. So this end here would basically be attaching to the greater curvature of your stomach, something like this. And then this would continue on as over the stomach as visceral peritoneum, and then continue on as the lesser curvature up here. And so the greater omentum is really something like this. It has a hollow, it's basically just a sheet of mesentery that sort of folds over on itself. And so there's this sort of free flap here, and there are really two leaves. There's what's called a superficial leaf, which is here, and then a deep leaf, which is here. And if this were a real cadaver, and this was real greater omentum, or if this was a real mammalian cadaver, whether it's human or something else, what you would see when you sort of cut through the this is me cutting through your abdominal wall, through the abdominal musculature. When you remove that muscle back, what you will see is basically a sheet of very fatty tissue, which is your greater omentum. Again, it looks pretty much just like that. But what you can do, which you can't do on this model, is you can literally lift this up, sort of like, they call this sometimes the greater omentum, they call it sometimes a lacy apron. You can lift this up and then look at the structures that are underneath and then sort of put it back again. Okay, so that's a little schematic of essentially what the greater omentum looks like, sort of a slightly more realistic rendition. In any case, let's move on. So when we get to the end of the ileum, that's where the small intestine ends and then turns into the large intestine, which is shown here in gray. The ileum ends at everyone's favorite sphincter, which is called the ileocecal valve, which is shown here. This is basically just a sphincter, yet another sphincter of the many that we have gone through already on covering the GI tract, that regulates the passage of chyme, of this acidified digested food, what's left of it in any case, as it passes from the small intestine here to the large intestine here. The first part of the large intestine is this sort of dead end pouch here, which is called the cecum, and is basically this region right here. The cecum has a little blind sac on the back side of it, which you can see if you flip this over. And it's this structure here, which is your appendix, sometimes known as the vermiform appendix. Vermiform means worm-like, because I guess it looks like a little worm, at least in people. In other mammals, it gets, especially herbivorous mammals, it gets much larger. So this is the vermiform appendix. This is your cecum. And then we go to the next part of the large intestine, which is going to be your ascending colon, shown here. So cecum, ascending colon. Ascending colon goes up the right side of your abdominal cavity. And then it basically makes a turn, what we call a flexure in anatomies, and then it turns into this part of your large intestine, which is called your transverse colon. The colon basically runs from the right side of your body, to the left side of your body. And then it basically descends, it goes down again as the descending colon down the left side of your abdominal cavity. From there, the descending colon makes this little S-shaped curve here, which we call the sigmoid colon. Sigmoid because it resembles the letter S. And then finally, the sigmoid colon turns into the rectum, which is shown here. And that's it. So rectum, sigmoid colon, transverse colon, ascending colon, cecum, and then vermiform appendix. Those are the parts of your large intestine. There's one other detail in the large intestine that we'd like you to appreciate, and it's the structure that you see here. If you notice, the large intestine is broken up into these little sort of pouch-like structures. You can see one here, another one here, another one here. These pouch-like structures are called haustra, or singular, I think is haustrum. And these pouches are formed by these little lines that make these sacculations that separate one haustra from another. The lines that make these sacculations are called plicae semilunares. Plicae means fold, and so it's basically just a fold of tissue that's causing this. Specifically, what's forming this fold that's separating one haustrum from the other is part of your I'm getting ahead of myself. Sorry. You've got the haustrum here, and you've got the plicae semilunares. This is basically a semilunar type of fold, or half moon shape of a fold. Yes. So what forms this in part forms the plica semilunares is in part part of the muscularis externa, one of the three tunics that make up the wall of your GI tract. You recall the muscularis externa has two subdivisions to them. Do you remember what they are? That's right. There's the inner circular. It forms sphincters. Yay! And then there's the outer longitudinal that runs sort of longitudinal, that runs the parallel to the length of the GI tract. In this case, this is formed by constrictions of your inner circular layer of your muscularis externa. It helps form these plica, which separate the colon into these pouches that are called haustra. The other feature we want you to appreciate is this thing that looks like a racing stripe sort of going down. Whoa, the racing stripe that's going down sort of the length of the colon. Or some people refer to this as sort of a ribbon. This ribbon-like structure that's shown here sort of in grayish white is a structure called your tinea coli or coli. And this is formed by the second of the two layers of the muscularis externa, the outer longitudinal layer. It forms a constriction here that forms this band. Now you'll notice you can only see one band here, but in fact there are three. You don't need to worry about the number of bands, but for those who are interested, there are actually three of these bands. You only see one in this case on this side, but the other two appear when you go down here to the rectum. And so the one we were just looking at is this band here, and the other two sort of are found on the other side. They're sort of attached or associated with the mesentery. You see one side here and another side here. Those are the tinea coli formed by the muscularis externa. So again, what we don't want you to, what we want you to keep straight, don't confuse, is that this is a named mesentery, dorsal mesentery, which we call the greater omentum, and this is going to the greater curvature of the stomach, and this mesentery is just called mesentery. It's really called like mesocolon or mesoduodenum, but this is mesentery that's going to the small and large intestine. There's another anatomical model, an older version that looks something like this, that also may appear in some of your figures. This is essentially the same thing as this, what we were seeing before, just a little less decorative. So again, we have the large intestine here. This is the transverse colon. We have jejunum up here and ileum down here. And then this is the greater omentum. This is the part that attaches to the greater curvature. Here is all the leafy apron part. And you can see the fold that it makes here, where it sort of folds like a pancake, like a crepe here, and then, or like an omelet. It's yellow after all. Here, and then it goes up to the transverse colon. So again, this is greater omentum. And on the flip side, the reason I show you this model is the mesentery is depicted quite nicely. So again, here's your transverse colon. Here's the mesentery that's suspending the rest of your GI tract. And you can see the extensive arterial and venous supply that go to it, as well as the lymphatics. And there will also be, of course, nerves going to this as well. All right, gang, I think that's it for the general anatomy of the lower GI tract. Hope you found that helpful, and I hope it helps you with your studies. Best of luck to you, and thank you for joining me. Stay safe and stay healthy. Bye-bye.